Blasphemous 2 is a game about aborting God while wearing a funny hat. When the game was first announced, it was clear from the start that it would have gorgeous pixel art, morbidly fascinating world building, and quite satisfying combat. It is, after all, the sequel of a game that gets all this right.
The big question was whether it could pull off a metroidvania structure, something that its predecessor didn't quite manage. Blasphemous, the original, is technically a metroidvania, but not in spirit. At least its progression system prevents it from fully capturing some of the genre's core ideals.
For metroidvania progression, it isn't enough that the main character simply gets stronger, as in this case by increasing health, fervor, damage and more. It's good to have that, don't get me wrong, but it's something any platformer with RPG elements would do. What sets metroidvanias apart is that this progression is deeply tied to level design. In Hollow Knight, the Mothwing Cloak isn't simply a +1 to your stats. It's a new way of interacting with the world that opens up new areas and, just as importantly, recontextualizes areas you've already visited. This recontextualization isn't some technicality that only matters for definition of metroidvanias, it's a central part of the experience. First, it creates an intrinsic sense of discovery, where progression allows you to satisfy your curiosity about the surrounding world. A simple ledge that's too high to reach is oh so tantalizing to the curious player. An incentive is created to continue playing even before the player actually gets rewarded. When the player does get a double jump item, nothing matches the delight of recalling that, oh wait, there was that one place and I can go there now and see what's up there. It's this guy, he's up there.
And then of course there's the extrinsic reward of getting new stuff. Regardless of whether it affects gameplay in any meaningful capacity, getting stuff feels good.
Metroidvanias are particularly great at this, because 1. Level design itself is reinforcing the sense of getting stronger. 2. There's also a lovely loop of secondary rewards, where you don't just feel great for finding new stuff, but you also know that you can use this stuff to find other stuff.
If you think about just how rewarded the player feels in this progression structure, it's really not that hard to see why so many people love Metroidvanias.
Blasphemous does this a little bit and kind of misses the mark. The items that let you interact with the world in new ways are called relics, of which there are 7 in the game, all of which optional for reaching the end. Right off the bat, what confuses me the most is that you're limited to equipping 3 at a time, which just seems like a really bad decision. There's no upside to this. Instead of feeling like you become stronger, you feel like you can be stronger. Sometimes, if you open up a menu and go to the relics tab and unequip another item, it's not good. The relics themselves are kind of lame. They seem like an afterthought really. You can explore a vast majority of the game's world without them, and each only has a handful of specific places where they can be used. Outside of these few clearly marked locations for each relic, most of them hold no utility whatsoever. They don't feel like improvements to your character, they feel like keys that open up a handful of doors, but only if you open up a menu and go to the relics tab.
Overall, the relics in Blasphemous are kind of a disappointment. The shallow interactions and the fact that they're so meaningless to the overall progression feels like a serious problem. A central part of the genre is reduced to an optional clunky gimmick. And, I mean, the game is good, don't get me wrong, and it's fine for it to focus on combat and aesthetics instead of Metroidvania progression. But if it doesn't use the appropriate design for Metroidvanias, then it doesn't get to reap the benefits of being a Metroidvania, making the experience feel flat compared to its brethren.
For Blasphemous 2, the Metroidvania structure is clearly much more present in the developer's intent. To quote the creative director Enrique Cabeza,
"What we wanted to do with the sequel was to create more of a pure Metroidvania game, because the original game, which had elements of it, wasn't technically a true game in that style."
This shift in structure is most noticeable in how the Penitent One's core abilities progress. The first game's awkward relic system has been replaced with a more traditional approach, where level design gets recontextualized by new weapons in the first half of the game and new abilities in the second half. Starting with the weapons, the game lets you choose one of 3 options at the beginning of the game, with the other 2 found later through regular progression. The weapons themselves interact with the level design, so if you have Benedicto, you'll be able to ring these bells, but you'll need Sarmiento and Centella to use these mirrors, and Ruego al Alba is required to get past these barriers. What's important here is that the player chooses the order in which they find these weapons, up to and including the weapon they start with. It means the level design has to work no matter what options the player has available, which is an impressive task. It demands some skillful craftsmanship. The result is a sense of openness and scale. The player has meaningful agency over how they progress. And there's a very satisfying rush in having many different directions available to explore. The first half of the game and its open approach successfully captures the Metroidvania appeal. The abilities you find in the second half are considerably more rewarding than the weapons you acquire before, because these abilities are permanent changes to the base character. They don't need to be equipped or shuffled through, they just stay there. The original's relics are replaced with a double jump and a dash, both of which are excellent decisions. There's a good reason why these mechanics are so popular in platformers, and it's that they're extremely elegant and pleasing to use. The fact that the first game doesn't have double jumps feels wrong, because that's essentially expected of modern platformers. The new abilities don't just unlock new places, they're also satisfying to use in combat and platforming, another example of the sequel being a superior Metroidvania. Despite all that, the second half does end up being considerably weaker on account of the game becoming somewhat linear. The areas and bosses in the second half are all unlocked one after another. The great sense of openness and choice are replaced with a disappointingly straightforward path. It's in some ways inverse of Hollow Knight, in which the first half of the game was relatively linear until it suddenly explodes with possibility and vastness.
This approach is clearly superior, and while Hollow Knight may set an unreasonably high standard to live up to, I can't help thinking about how much better this game could be if the last areas were accessed in any order.
Zooming in on smaller details of the progression, we again find that the sequel mostly shows improvement over the original, but with some strange decisions sprinkled in. Take for example the idea of figures. This is a sort of continuation of the first game's rosary bead system. You have a limited capacity to equip items which provide a variety of passive bonuses. The second game still has rosary beads, but it also has a similar system of figures, which give additional bonuses if equipped in certain pairs. I have neutral feelings on this. The added mechanic makes figures more interesting on paper, but the truth is that exploring the system through UI interactions just isn't all that exciting. I also preferred the first game's collectible bones over the sequel's idea of simply finding Tears of Atonement in special containers. The collectibles have a sense of finitude. They are a progress bar that you can fill, and this scratches the psychological itch that makes Metroidvanias so appealing to completionists. The second game removes the middleman and simply gives you Tears of Atonement, but that sense of finitude is missing, and it's a very small downgrade, but one worth pointing out.
All of that highlights how the Metroidvania format has evolved in the franchise, but if you're interested in a more holistic review of Blasphemous 2, we can also take a quick look at the other genre influencing this game's design, soulslike games.
Regardless of what annoying nerds will tell you about stamina bars and other drivel, the one really important design distinction for soulslike games is combat intentionality. Comparing soulslikes to the average combat-oriented game, you find a lot more purpose in each movement. Combat in these games becomes a dance, where the many options of the player's moveset are carefully opposing the nuances of the enemy's own movement, all the while strategically using the environment to get an edge over the opponent. The Blasphemous franchise takes some inspiration from the genre, and I strongly respect its attempts to do so. The combat really is much more involved and purposeful in its micro-decisions than what you'll find in similar games, and I enjoyed mastering the Penitent One's moveset and learning counterplay for the various creative and interesting boss fights. Accompanied by the extremely intricate animations, the combat in these games ends up being really well crafted. Both games, however, suffer from the same important problem, which is that the combat is a bit too easy, and as a result you never really have to fully master these mechanics. You'll sometimes get away with simple button mashing. In the second game, there are 2 boss fights that ask you to actually use parries and learn the tells of your opponent, and those are by far my favorite moments of the game. The other bosses are mostly pushovers. There's a lot of battles with really intricate and creative mechanics, but they're so easy that you'll never be engaging with those mechanics. The battles read as if they're balanced for some kind of average player that doesn't do any exploration and thus doesn't progress much with their character. The result is that the less committed player isn't sufficiently encouraged to explore the game's world, while the committed player is bored. Granted, updates to the game have helped to some degree. The second game does make one great improvement over the first one in its difficulty and soulslike elements, and it's the fact that pits and spikes no longer instantly kill you. The platforming in these games is entirely passable, but not without flaw, so the decision to cut a needlessly frustrating element in order to focus more on the actual strengths of the game is a really good decision. I've seen some people who preferred instantly dying in spikes, but the opinions of those people should be completely discredited and they should repent.
Overall, it's a well-done sequel that shows a far more mature understanding of the genre and its design. Granted, it has its weak points, but there's a lot to appreciate here. I might have made the games sound a bit worse than they are, but that's because this franchise, its strengths and its weaknesses are a really insightful stepping stone for understanding Metroidvania design.
The Blasphemous games just suffer from a curse that they share with the Ori franchise, the curse of being compared to Hollow Knight. A game that doesn't even do anything particularly new, it just understands the tropes of the genre and executes on them so perfectly that it's genuinely impolite.
So if there's one important thing we've learned today, it's that Dead Cells is not a Metroidvania.
For silly, even goofy are the ways of the miracle.